On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Matt Robben. He is the co-founder and CTO at Serif Health. We're going to be talking about operationally growing capacity. What do I mean? Well, when times are good, obviously people hire a lot. When times are bad, people have to make do with what they have. And we're seeing a trend towards that full stack engineering hire. I guess there's a couple of things that come with that. How do you manage that growth? What happens down the road? How do you help people grow their skill sets if they're coming in full stack? And we're going to see how far we get with Matt. I got a bunch of other things hopefully I'll get to, but Matt, thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Awesome, man. What does Serif Health do? Tell everyone before we dive in.
For sure. We are a price transparency data company in healthcare. So what that means is there's a bunch of laws that were just passed a few years ago that require hospitals and insurance companies to publish the rate that they pay behind the scenes for every service in the healthcare system. It's a lot of data because there's a lot of providers doing a lot of billing and a lot of codes. So we aggregate all that together and then build essentially analytics on top of that and distribute that data to folks that are interested in using it.
All right. So let's talk about this concept of, providing the bandwidth to grow. Obviously, we're in a time where some companies are a little bit more constrained in hiring. Obviously, 21, 22, people hired a lot. People are hiring a little bit less. And we were talking, I guess, off air about the move towards a full stack engineer. I guess maybe help us understand if your company that maybe is, hiring for less engineers overall. And I guess it depends the size of the company, right? So it depends, I guess. But if we're early stage startup, right? Let's focus. Serif is an early stage startup. Let's kind of focus on that segment of the market. Why does it make sense to hire, I guess, what would be considered potentially a generalist engineer versus specialist?
Yeah, great question. So we're a small seed stage startup. We need to grow the team very thoughtfully. And we have a pretty limited budget to do so. Every seat is absolutely critical, and you need full output from that person. There's just always so much to get done the concept of full stack, when people say that, it means that there's not some boundary across which you're not willing to touch or work or figure out how to build something new. That's how I rationalize what that role really means. And it's so critical to have that because if I've got a small team, maybe it's 4 people, 6 people, 2 people, doesn't really matter, right? And you bring someone on who says, well, I can only work on the API and I don't want to touch the front end, or I can only do the front end because I'm really good at visuals and I really don't understand distributed systems, or I don't understand how to deploy a server or what DevOps means. That fear, which is really where that's coming from, right? I can't do this. That's just fear and saying, well, I only want to be good at this thing, or I only want to focus on this thing. You need folks that are willing to charge in and say, hey, to solve this problem, to build a product, to deliver value to this company, you've got to cover the whole thing, and you've got to ship software to people that's usable. And it's usually all of those components together. There's software frameworks that take a lot of this away from you. You've got Firebase, and you have AWS has the new framework that was launched a few years ago that really tries to remove some of that or hide some of that complexity, so you don't have to be full stack. But at the end of the day, it's always complicated, and it always needs a performance tweak, or somebody's got to dig in. And again, if you have somebody going, well, I don't know that, I'm not trained in that, I don't want to do that, or I'm scared of that, you don't have that capacity, right? And now with my limited seats, either I as the CTO and co-founder have to do it, or I have to go hire again, which I don't even have the budget to do and the time to do. So you can see where mentally for me, the flexible engineer is really attractive in that early stage seat.
That completely makes sense. Obviously, you have to balance what work gets done, and obviously you can't be too heavy on either side of the spectrum. And maybe we could talk about, as you see growth happening, we can just maybe forecast. Let's say, you guys are going to, over the next 5 years, triple, quadruple, I don't know, some fictitious number. It doesn't matter. I mean, when we're looking at growth, hopefully, yeah. I mean, fingers are crossed for you. I'd love to see it be bigger than that. But I guess just talking about the team topology as you see growth, Is there a tipping point in which case you look at the team and go, being more specialized makes sense? Are there specific skills? Are there specific parts of the stack that you would probably gravitate towards a specialist before others?
Yeah, great question there too. I mean, I think there's roles in engineering that a generalist can still attempt to do, but probably isn't going to do so well, or you're going to wind up introducing a lot of technical debt, trying to just get something to work. And case in point for Serif Health, we are a data company, right? We didn't know that's what we were going to be in our very earliest days. There was a lot of pivoting around. And again, we needed that full stack flexibility. But once we anchored on this problem that we're solving and we realized, oh my gosh, we're a big data company. I'm not a data engineer. And the generalists that we brought in, our earliest founding engineers, were not data engineers either. And data warehousing is a specialist subject. There's big data ETL and Spark and all these different technologies that, as a generalist, you probably aren't going to get a lot of exposure to it. And yes, we can figure out how to do a query or two, but how do you set up the architecture of a data warehouse for longevity, that's sustainable for a company like us to operate effectively and cost effectively and solve really hard problems that my skill set can't get done? So again, that's not coming from that place of just general fear or I don't know how to do this, as much as, hey, there might be somebody out there who's done this for 10 years, just this problem. And because of where we are and what we're trying to do with our business, it makes a ton of sense to bring them in. And so we actually did hire our founding data engineer, Salman. He came from GoodRx, where he'd been working in healthcare data. He knew data warehousing, full stop, and all sorts of stuff that was just impressive. You talk to him in the interview and it's like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what I don't know about this. This is wonderful. We need you here. And so I think the moment that you start saying, hey, we are blocked on these things, these are extremely hard questions. And if you interview or talk to somebody and they seem like they have all of the answers and you're kind of like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize you could do it that way. That's a good sign a specialist makes sense. And I would probably also point out, with the move towards artificial intelligence, right? It's probably the new wave of all of this. If you are going to try and build a custom model and train AI, which are very hot topics right now, I'd also argue that's something, if you have been a generalist product engineer like myself, you aren't going to know the statistics. You aren't going to know, the frameworks being used and what you need to do that well or correctly. You might have an off-the-shelf toolkit or something that you play with. But again, if you're going to build your whole business as an AI tech company, probably makes sense to find a really specialized developer who's done that for the last few years, that understands that technology deeply and will do it well and right, that you can, build a sustainable company. So that's kind of how I think that pivot point comes, is once you realize and really know what you're doing, where you're going, and you have that mission critical role that isn't coverable. Like that's how I see the inflection point.
I guess, the one thing that comes to mind is obviously right now you are hiring, let's say, for more full stack engineers. Your interview processes are probably dialed in. As you potentially grow and look at other roles, how do you I guess you're trying to hire sometimes for roles that the company doesn't have skill sets for. I think you mentioned data engineering or a particular, let's say, more niche type of skill set. What happens to the interview process? Because obviously you're kind of honed in on one type of role. If you're trying to plan for that, is that something you just deal with at the time? Do you have to potentially have the team ramp up on some of those aspects of the technology to be able to really ascertain someone's qualifications? What happens?
Wow. I didn't even realize, but I think as a founder, I've sort of internalized that it just becomes my responsibility to get ahead of that set of questions and be able to probe and interrogate and rapidly understand whether we can trust this individual to fill out that space. I talked about all the things I didn't know that I learned just during the interview. Asking the right questions of that individual on the hardest problems that you have, and feeling like you come out of the interview learning something, that's a great way to say, like, okay, like we don't have anybody qualified to call BS or to know whether this is the best way or the right way or the wrong way. But again, I think when we went through that process with hiring our data engineer, that realization really showed me we need this person on the team. And I, when you're hiring full stack, you probably got a pretty dialed in interview process, like you said. I don't think that you have that like aha moment because the problems are usually pretty on the rails. You're going for something with a pretty static rubric. You've seen this 100 times, you know what to expect. And there's usually not somebody who completely blows that out of the park in a different way than you've ever seen possible. So, the open-ended questioning becomes really important, and knowing how to get to that level of trust with someone, almost to the point where you're like, yep, I believe I could drop this person in this seat. And then the first 30, 60, 90 days, they're going to execute on these areas that I know are the hardest problems that are set out right in front of us. And so that's actually what the second stage of the interview process was okay, like, I'm just going to tell you our hard problems and let's map out, like, what does this look like? How would you execute on these? How long is it going to take? And that was another really good question because we interviewed a couple of different roles. We thought we needed a data scientist because we didn't know that wasn't what we need. We thought we needed a data, so we had data scientists, data engineers, and data analysts all come in interviewing for this role. And I learned very quickly some of the differences between those titles. The data engineers are very focused on data orchestration and pipelines and transforms. The scientists are very much about playing with the data and doing statistical analysis and being in the weeds that way. And the analyst role is a lot more of like, okay, I'm really good at standing up BI tools and search and mechanically working with the data on less of a scientific basis. So yeah, asking people, can you solve this? And what's the timeline? If you ask a data scientist to solve something and a data engineer to solve something, it's amazing. You'll get, oh yeah, that'll take me a week or two to set up a pipeline. Whereas you get, I need 3 months to do research. And I'll turn around a model for you that can answer this, across all future data sets too. And again, that wasn't what we needed. We needed somebody who was tactical, who was looking at it and saying, yep, I can move fast on this. And we can be able to move this data around. And that was, again, the right fit for what we needed as an organization.
I like that because I think that's some great insights because I think a lot of people have run into these scenarios of hiring people a little bit outside the scope of what they've been comfortable with or what they've needed. I guess to kind of flip back to the present and the current team and talk a little bit about obviously full stack engineering, providing, growing operational capacity, obviously bringing in people that can do different things. How do you support a team that is, let's say, more full stack oriented and people want to grow into a specialist area? There's a project that comes up, they want to tackle it. Obviously, they still need to deliver what their mandate is in that full stack area, but hey, they want to go learn or go extend themselves in something else. How do you balance that so that they can have that mobility?
Yeah, the way that we generally will do that is I think folks have a tendency of what they'd like to work on, right? So as long as you know what that is, when we go into our Monday morning prioritization and sort of tiling meeting where we're setting the swim lanes for everyone and understanding, you're on this, you're on that. For folks who want those kinds of certain opportunities, when you get a project that comes up that's entirely backend focused, or when you can subdivide a task and say, well, we need the backend done first anyway, so we can see what it, play with the data, the shape of the API. You can let that person run on that as a priority and get that learning or growth opportunity out of it. And if you need to, you can break it apart and hand off, the other piece to someone if you want to make it, parallelizable, or you can, have them follow through with that. But really, we see it as just matching people's interests and sort of where they want to work to, what's on the backlog this Monday. And that model, I think, encourages that flexibility of, yeah, some days our front end focused engineer will do back end, and some weeks, but not the majority of them, right? It's the occasional opportunity where it feels like it's a good fit. And by not forcing that, it's organic. I don't have to assign this stuff out. It's very much everybody's picking from a list and saying, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. I'd like to take that on this week. So that's one model that can work there. The support piece that you asked about is interesting because when you have T-shaped people where you've got a lot of generalist tendency, but you do have some strengths, we can have our front end focused engineer code review for the backend engineer who's dabbling in the front end that week, right? And that weak sense of, okay, there's a little bit of mentorship there. There's at least a little bit of coverage. There's extra eyeball. Hey, did you know that like there's a better pattern? There's a better way to do this, right? You get that really rapid learning and knowledge sharing between the team from experience without that engineer that has less context or less experience just trying to read it from the code. So that code review back and forth, I think, is another sort of critical point where you can get exposure, you can get some knowledge transfer, and it's a win-win for everybody.
I like that. I like the ability for people to have that chance to grow, right? Because I think when you talk about trying to maximize your team, the last thing you need is for somebody to leave because they don't see that opportunity and they think they need to go outside to kind of go above and beyond. When you guys look to hire, and let's say obviously full stack engineer, you want them to be really good at their job. How much do you look at some of the, outside the scope capabilities? Hey, this person might be able to grow into this down the road, or they might be able to, potentially pick something up for us versus, right now we need the full stack engineer. So I guess the real question is when you're hiring that engineer, how much of your focus is, I need the best possible person for the now versus, hey, we'll take maybe the less skilled full stack engineer, but the person that might have an opportunity to grow wider or I guess deeper in a particular area?
Yeah, I'd actually answer that with a slightly different, neither of the two. I'd say what I index on a lot is just that capacity and like eagerness to tackle something greenfield, new, and challenging, right? There's so much about engineering software that is not predictable, that is not a rote pattern, that is not something I can just go to ChatGPT and say, hey, give me the code for this. And hey, my job's done and I can go back to doing what I did, right? I've got to map a custom domain to software that doesn't express naturally, to solve this kind of problem. There's unexpected requirements, things shift on a dime, right? And there's so many challenges like that again, when you get handed an open-ended problem, like I'll just throw one out from what we're working on. I want to be able to search geographically by putting a pin on a map, drawing a circle around it, and I want to see, all this healthcare pricing data that way. Well, there is no geolocation in the original data set, and there's billions of records. So how do you geolocate billions of records and enable that map-based search and use the databases we have at our disposal and all these other challenges? That's just a hard, okay, like you have to go and redo all of this and figure that out and enable the experience. I want folks that are willing to just go, okay, I've never worked with geolocation data before. I don't know how to do a fast index geolocation search, but I'm going to read some manuals. I'm going to figure it out. And in a week, I can have a working prototype. And maybe in 2 weeks, we've got this over all the billions of data points. If you have folks that have that mentality, it doesn't matter what's on your resume. It doesn't matter what your titles were, right? It's the fact that you look at it as I'm solving these problems and I'm willing to do what needs to be done to get there. And that eagerness, in my opinion, is what translates to that really high impact growth individual. If that person wants to go chase AI ML for me, awesome, because I trust that they're going to do the hard work and the learning required to go figure it out. And that's something that I really do try and interview for at Serif Health through design of the interview process as well. Our first interview is a take home. And there's a sort of an easy, obvious, like rote way to do it. But we hint in the take home, you've got to do some extra thinking and some extra creative legwork here. And that's not a codable solution. It's just, you just have to think and be creative and use Google and use tools at your disposal like that. And when you see somebody solve the take home and has gone that extra mile, again, it's indicating that sense of, I'm not looking for what fits in this neat little box. I'm looking for like understanding this space and solving the whole problem. And I index very heavily in that, and that's part of our rubric. So I think, when we think about what we want in the team, we want folks that have that attribute, and that engenders flexibility and growth, in my opinion, more than an interest or they've bounced around a few roles or have a history of exposing themselves to like different software domains.
I really like that, Matt. I think you cover this topic Pretty well. I think I threw a bunch of different stuff, left field, right field. I try to keep it on track as well. So I appreciate that. I'm sure it's not exhaustive and we could continue for a while. And someone might say, hey, Amir, you forgot to ask this question. I'd love to know what Matt's thoughts. If somebody does want to reach out to you to pick your brain on something you mentioned, what is a good way of touching base with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn. LinkedIn's great. Very active on there. Happy to take requests and network with folks through that portal. Yeah, if you have something that has to be asked more directly or private, Matt at Serif Health is my email. Happy to take inbounds and help anybody else with their hiring or recruiting challenges. So
awesome. I definitely appreciate the time. Thank you for coming on, sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it, Amir.
Absolutely. That's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think we had some really great tips, insights into hiring full stack now and kind of what happens as you grow. Because I think obviously at Serif Health, they're at that point where they're going through this, and Matt shared a lot of stuff that he's seeing, and he's got a great background. So please share this with somebody else who might find it interesting. Reach out to Matt if you do have a follow-up question. Please like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.